15 years ago, I went on a hiking trip with three of my closest friends, Jake, Mike, and Sarah. It's a story I don't talk about much. Even now, after all these years, I can still feel the cold air of that forest and hear the crunch of leaves under our boots. But what I remember most is the feeling that we were being watched. Let me start at the beginning. It was the middle of October, and the weather was perfect for camping. Cool enough that we could enjoy a fire at night, but not so cold that we'd freeze in our tents. We'd all been talking about doing this trip for months. The plan was simple: hike up into the forest, set up camp, and spend a couple of days away from the world. Just 4 friends, a couple of tents, and a lot of snacks. We parked the car at a trailhead and hiked for hours. The forest was thick and silent, except for the occasional bird or crack of a branch. By late afternoon, we found a flat clearing by a small stream. It was perfect. We set up camp, 2 tents side by side, collected some firewood, and settled in for the evening. That first night was great. We sat around the fire, told stories, roasted marshmallows, and laughed until our faces hurt. Mike, who always tried to be the tough guy, swore he saw something move in the trees at one point, but Sarah just rolled her eyes. We all knew Mike loved to try to scare us. By midnight, the fire was just glowing embers, and we climbed into our tents. Sarah and I shared one, while Mike and Jake took the other. The forest was quiet again. I fell asleep almost immediately. The next day, we decided to explore further down the stream. We hiked for hours, climbing over fallen logs and navigating through thick brush. By late afternoon, we were tired and ready to head back. That's when we found it. Jake spotted it first. "Hey, what's that?" At the base of a big tree, there was a patch of dirt that looked wrong. It was loose, like it had been dug up recently. We gathered around it, curious. I don't know why we started digging. Maybe it was just instinct, curiosity getting the best of us. Jake grabbed a stick and started scraping at the dirt. After a few minutes, something black appeared. It was a digital camera, an old one of those bulky point-and-shoot cameras that people used before phones got so good. It was dirty and scratched, but the battery compartment looked fine. "That's weird," Sarah muttered as Jake wiped dirt off the lens with his sleeve. We all agreed it was strange, but we were more curious about what was on the camera. Maybe someone had lost it while hiking, or maybe it had fallen out of a bag. Back at camp, Mike rummaged through his stuff and found some spare batteries he'd brought for his flashlight. Somehow they fit the camera. "Let's see what's on this thing," he said, grinning. The camera turned on with a faint beep. The screen was cracked, but we could still make out the images. Jake clicked through them one by one. The first few photos were of campsites, tents, campfires, people sitting around laughing, normal stuff. But none of the people in the photos looked familiar. Whoever owned the camera had taken pictures of different groups camping in the forest, sometimes from far away, sometimes close up. "Okay, that's kind of creepy," Sarah said. Mike shrugged. Maybe they were just practicing photography. We kept clicking through the pictures. As we went on, they got stranger. There were shots of tents taken from the woods, like someone had been hiding behind trees. Some were blurry, like they'd been taken in a rush. Others were so close that you could see the stitching on the fabric of the tents. The 4 of us were quiet now. There was something wrong about these photos. Jake clicked again. This time, the pictures looked familiar. The clearing, the stream, our campsite. Mike froze. "Wait, is that us?" It was. The next few photos were taken from a distance. Shots of us sitting by the fire the night before, completely unaware. There was one of Jake collecting firewood, one of Sarah sitting on a log, tying her boot, and then one of me staring straight into the camera. I didn't remember seeing anyone. None of us did. "Maybe someone's messing with us," Sarah whispered, but her voice was shaking. We kept going. The last pictures on the memory card were taken at night. The first few were of our tents, dark shapes against the moonlight. The final ones made my blood go cold. They were close-ups of us, sleeping. There was one of Mike, his mouth slightly open, his face relaxed in sleep. One of Sarah, curled up in her sleeping bag. And one of me, my face lit faintly by the camera flash. We stared at the screen, not saying a word. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. "Who took these?" Jake finally asked, his voice low. We all looked at each other, and it hit us at the same time. Whoever had taken those photos had been in our camp. standing just feet away from us while we slept. Mike stood up suddenly, his head snapping toward the trees. "This isn't funny. If someone's out there, come out now." His voice echoed through the forest, but there was no answer, just the wind rustling through the leaves. Sarah grabbed my arm. "We need to go." She was right. None of us wanted to stay another night. We packed up as fast as we could. I didn't even bother rolling up my sleeping bag. I just shoved it into my pack. The whole time, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the clearing, but there was no one. We hiked back to the car in silence. The trail felt longer than before, and every sound made us jump. By the time we finally reached the parking lot, the sun was starting to set. None of us spoke as we threw our packs in the trunk and got into the car. As we drove away, Mike broke the silence. We should have left the camera. Nobody disagreed. We never talked about that trip again. Not really. Jake moved to another state a year later, and we lost touch. Sarah and Mike stuck around, but we all pretended it never happened. I don't even know what happened to the camera. Maybe Jake still has it, or maybe he threw it away. I don't want to know. Sometimes, though, when I'm lying in bed at night, I think about those photos. I think about how someone stood there, just a few feet away from us, watching us sleep. And I wonder if somewhere out there, they're still watching. When I was about 20 years old, I decided to take my then-girlfriend, Emma, on a camping trip. I wasn't exactly the outdoorsy type, but I wanted to do something special for her. She loved nature and had grown up hiking with her family. I figured a camping trip with a rented camper would be the perfect mix of adventure and comfort. I rented the RV from a guy a few towns over. It wasn't brand new, but it was clean and worked well enough. The guy handed me the keys and said, "Take care of her. She's been through a lot of trips." He had a weird smile when he said it, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Emma and I hit the road early on a Friday morning. The plan was to spend 2 nights in a quiet campground I'd found online. It was a small, wooded spot near a lake, far from the usual crowds, perfect for a weekend escape. The drive out there was nice. Emma played music while I focused on the road. The sun was bright, and everything felt simple and easy. We arrived in the late afternoon, found our spot, and parked the camper. The campground was nearly empty. Only 2 other campers were parked far off in the distance. I liked that. It made it feel like we had the place to ourselves. We set up quickly, laying out camping chairs and building a small fire pit. I told Emma I'd sleep in the camper, but she said she wanted to sleep outside in a tent to be closer to nature. I didn't really care, so I agreed. It was her trip, after all. As the sun set, the woods around us turned dark and quiet. The only sounds were crickets and the occasional crackle of the fire. We cooked hot dogs, laughed about how bad I was at pitching the tent, and stayed up late, staring at the stars. Around midnight, the fire died down, and we decided to call it a night. Emma crawled into the tent while I stayed out a little longer to put the fire out completely. Afterward, I climbed into the tent with her, too lazy to go back into the RV. I remember it being warm inside the tent, with the quiet of the forest wrapping around us. I fell asleep almost immediately. When I woke up, it was still dark. Something had pulled me out of sleep, but I didn't know what. I turned over and glanced at Emma, who was snoring softly beside me. I was about to close my eyes again when I heard it, a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't coming from the forest. It was coming from the RV. At first, I thought maybe an animal had gotten in somehow. Raccoons, maybe. But then I heard it again. Soft footsteps. Slow and deliberate. I froze. It wasn't an animal. Someone was walking around inside the RV. I held my breath, listening harder. I could hear the faint creak of the floorboards and the sound of something being moved, a bag or a piece of furniture. I nudged Emma gently. "Emma," I whispered. She groaned a little, not fully awake. "Emma, wake up," I said, sharper this time. "What?" she mumbled, still half asleep. "Shh, there's someone in the camper." That got her attention. Her eyes flew open, and she sat up quickly, pulling the sleeping bag around her. "What do you mean?" she whispered back. "Listen." We both stayed perfectly still, listening to the quiet around us. The footsteps had stopped. The RV was silent. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Then we heard it again. Footsteps, this time moving faster, as though someone was pacing. I felt a cold chill run through me. Emma's hand gripped my arm tightly. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice shaking. I thought about it. We were outside, and whoever was in the RV hadn't noticed us, or so I hoped. I didn't want to confront them. I had no weapon, no plan. "Let's pack up and leave," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Now?" "Yes," quietly. "We grab what we can, get in the RV, and drive away." Emma nodded, and we started to move. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could, the sound of the zipper cutting through the silence. Every noise felt too loud, like it would give us away. We didn't bother folding the tent. I grabbed it in a ball and stuffed it into my arms. Emma picked up the cooler and our bags. We worked quickly, keeping our eyes on the camper the entire time. The windows were dark, and I couldn't see anyone inside, but I still felt like someone was watching us. Finally, we tiptoed to the RV door. I put my hand on the handle, took a deep breath, and yanked it open. The inside of the camper was pitch black. I couldn't see anything, but I didn't want to look. I just wanted to get out of there. I threw our stuff inside and climbed into the driver's seat, fumbling to get the keys into the ignition. Emma jumped into the passenger seat and slammed the door shut. I started the engine, my hands shaking. As the RV rumbled to life, I felt my heart pounding in my chest. I put it into drive and hit the gas. The tires crunched over the gravel as we pulled out of the campsite. I didn't look back. We drove in silence for a while, the only sound coming from the hum of the engine. Emma was sitting with her knees pulled up to her chest, staring out the window. After a few minutes, she finally spoke. "Do you think they're still in there?" I glanced at her. "I don't know. I don't want to know." I kept driving until we reached a rest stop an hour later. We parked under the bright lights, surrounded by other cars and trucks. It felt safe there. I turned off the engine and leaned back in my seat, letting out a long breath. Neither of us said much as we pulled the bags and blankets out of the RV. We sat on the ground near the vehicle, too afraid to go back inside. I kept staring at the RV door, half expecting it to open on its own. At some point, I realized I'd been gripping the keys so tightly, my hand was sore. We never figured out who was in the camper that night. When I returned the RV to the rental guy the next day, I didn't tell him what happened. I just wanted to leave and forget about it. To this day, I don't know how long that person had been inside. Did they sneak in while we were setting up camp? Were they already there when we picked up the RV? Sometimes I think back to that moment in the tent, when I woke up and heard those footsteps, and I wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed inside that night. I'm glad we didn't. Lisa and I had been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks. We wanted to escape the noise of the city and spend a quiet weekend in the woods. No phones, no schedules, just the two of us and nature. We arrived at the campsite late Friday afternoon, picking a spot near a small stream. The area was peaceful, with only a few other campers scattered around. I pitched the tent while Lisa unpacked our gear. By the time we got everything set up, the sun was dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. That's when I noticed them, a couple camping a little ways down the trail. Their tent was bright red and hard to miss. The guy looked to be about my age, tall with short brown hair. The woman, who was sitting by their campfire, had blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail. "Looks like we've got neighbors," I said, nodding in their direction. Lisa glanced over. "Maybe we should go say hi." I hesitated. I wasn't one for small talk, but Lisa was already walking toward them, so I followed. The man introduced himself as Eric, and the woman was Mia. They seemed friendly enough, though there was something about Eric that felt off. He kept looking over at their tent like he was nervous about something. Mia, on the other hand, barely spoke, just smiled politely and nodded. After a bit of awkward conversation, Lisa and I headed back to our campsite. "They seem nice," Lisa said as we cooked dinner over the fire. "Yeah, I guess," I replied, though I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling Eric gave me. The rest of the evening was quiet. We sat by the fire, listened to the stream, and watched the stars come out. The next morning, Lisa and I decided to go for a hike. The trail wound through the woods, leading to a rocky overlook with a view of the valley below. It was beautiful, and for a while, I forgot all about Eric and Mia. When we got back to the campsite, though, Eric was standing near our tent. "Hey," I called out, trying to keep my voice calm. "Everything okay?" He turned quickly, like I'd startled him. "Oh yeah, just wanted to borrow some matches. Ours got wet." I handed him a small box from my pack. "Here, you can keep these. We've got extras." "Thanks," he said, but instead of walking away, he stood there for a moment, looking past me at Lisa. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to his campsite. "That was weird," I muttered. Lisa frowned. "Maybe he's just shy." "Maybe," I said, though I didn't believe it. That night I couldn't sleep. The woods were too quiet, and I kept thinking I heard footsteps outside the tent. Lisa was sound asleep, so I stayed still, listening. After what felt like hours, I finally drifted off. The next morning, we went for another hike, this time along the stream. When we got back to the campsite, I noticed something strange. Eric and Mia's tent was still there, along with their gear. Camp chairs, a cooler, and some clothes hanging on a nearby branch to dry. But the campsite looked like it had been ransacked. The cooler was open, food scattered across the ground. One of the chairs was tipped over, and their sleeping bags were pulled halfway out of the tent. "Where are they?" Lisa asked, her voice tense. I didn't answer. I walked closer to their campsite, scanning the area. There was no sign of Eric or Mia. "Maybe they went for a walk?" Lisa suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. I shook my head. Why would they leave their tent like this? And their food? We waited for a while, hoping they'd come back, but the longer we stood there, the more uneasy I felt. "Let's go check the trail," I said finally. We walked up and down the nearby paths, calling their names, but there was no response. The forest felt heavier somehow, the trees pressing in on us. Back at their campsite, I took a closer look at the mess. There were no signs of animals, no paw prints, no scratches on the cooler. It looked like someone had gone through their stuff in a hurry, tossing things around. Lisa stood a few feet away, rubbing her arms. "This doesn't make sense. People don't just vanish like this." I didn't have an answer. We debated whether to leave or stay. Part of me wanted to pack up and get out of there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something bad had happened. What if they were hurt and needed help? In the end, we decided to stay one more night, hoping they'd return. That evening, we built a small fire and tried to relax, but neither of us could stop glancing toward the empty campsite. As darkness fell, the woods seemed to close in around us. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch made my heart race. Lisa sat close to me, her eyes wide and anxious. Around midnight I heard it, a faint sound like footsteps on the trail. "Did you hear that?" Lisa whispered. I nodded, gripping the flashlight tighter. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped. I shone the light into the trees, but there was nothing there. We didn't sleep at all that night. By dawn, we had packed up and were ready to leave. As we passed Eric and Mia's tent one last time, I felt a chill run down my spine. The tent flap was open, and inside, their sleeping bags were still there, perfectly laid out, as if they'd never been touched. We didn't talk much on the drive home. Lisa kept staring out the window, and I gripped the steering wheel tightly, replaying everything in my head. To this day, I don't know what happened to Eric and Mia. Maybe they got lost in the woods. Maybe they decided to leave in the middle of the night. But sometimes, when I think back to that night, I wonder if someone or something was watching us too. When I was 17, my family decided to go on one last camping trip before I left for college. It was the summer before everything changed. Before I moved out, before my parents split up, before life got complicated. Back then, camping was our thing. My dad loved the outdoors, and my mom went along with it for him. My little brother Evan was just 13, all energy and curiosity, always trying to prove he wasn't a kid anymore. Me, I just wanted some quiet before my life started somewhere new. We picked a remote spot that year, far away from the usual campgrounds. My dad had heard about it from someone at work, a hidden gem, he called it. No bathrooms, no other people, just us and the trees. To Dad, that sounded perfect. To me, it sounded like a good place to get eaten by bears. We arrived mid-morning. The drive had been long, and the forest seemed endless, thick and dark, with only the narrow dirt road cutting through it. When we finally parked, it was so quiet that it felt like the forest itself was waiting for something. I remember stepping out of the car and feeling like we were the only people for miles. We set up camp near a clearing, just off a small, overgrown trail. The forest felt close here, like the trees were crowding around us. Dad whistled as he unpacked the gear, and Evan immediately took off, stomping through the underbrush like he was on a grand adventure. Mom set up the little folding table for meals while I helped with the tent. By the afternoon, everything was ready. One tent for all of us, a small fire pit Dad built with stones, and a clothesline strung between two trees. We ate an early dinner, hot dogs and chips, sitting on logs around the fire. For a while it felt normal, peaceful even. But then Evan came back from the trees. I remember the way he looked, his face pale, his eyes wide. "There's someone out there," he said quietly. My dad frowned. "What are you talking about?" Evan pointed back toward the trail. "A man. He's just walking around. I think he's lost." At first, my dad didn't believe him. "Maybe it's another camper," he said, but Evan shook his head. "He's not like that. He looks weird." "Weird how?" I asked. Evan hesitated. His face is dirty, but his clothes look new, and he keeps stopping to look at things, like he doesn't know where he is. Dad grabbed his flashlight and stood up. "I'll check it out. You three stay here." "Let me come," I said quickly. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want Dad out there alone. We followed the path Evan had pointed to, Dad's flashlight beam cutting through the dimming woods. The air felt colder here. After about 5 minutes, we saw him. The man was standing in the middle of the trail, facing away from us. He looked completely still, like he was frozen. His clothes were clean, too clean. A brand new jacket, spotless boots, and a perfectly packed hiking bag. But his hands were dirty, and his hair was a mess. "Hey!" Dad called out, his voice steady. The man turned toward us slowly. His face looked pale and thin, his eyes sunken like he hadn't slept in days. But when he smiled, his teeth were bright white. It was jarring, like the smile didn't match the rest of him. "Thank God," the man said, his voice shaky. "I've been lost. I don't know how long." My dad lowered the flashlight slightly, but he didn't step closer. "Where are you coming from?" The man blinked like he didn't understand the question. "From everywhere. I got turned around." He paused. "Do you have a campsite nearby?" I didn't like the way he said it, so casual, like he already knew the answer. Dad didn't answer right away. Instead he said, "Do you need help? Water?" The man smiled again, wider this time. "That would be great." Dad nodded and gestured for him to follow us. I wanted to say something to stop him, but I didn't. I just stayed close to my dad as we walked back to camp, feeling the man's eyes on my back the whole time. When we got there, Mom's face froze. Evan moved closer to her, staring at the man like he was a ghost. Dad offered him a water bottle, and the man sat by the fire, right on the log Evan had been using earlier. Up close, something about him was wrong. His backpack looked full, perfectly packed, but he didn't open it to grab anything. His jacket didn't have a single wrinkle or stain, as though it had never been worn before. And yet his hands were filthy, the dirt caked deep under his fingernails. "What's your name?" Mom asked finally. "Brian," he said, but he paused before answering, like he had to think about it. Dad sat down across from him, watching him carefully. "How long have you been out here, Brian?" The man didn't answer right away. 3, maybe 4 days. He looked around the camp slowly, taking it all in. The tent, the clothesline, the cooler. Then he looked at Evan and smiled faintly. "Nice setup." Nobody spoke after that. The fire crackled, and I could hear the distant sound of crickets. Dad finally said, "Why don't you set up your tent? We can figure things out in the morning." Brian nodded, but he didn't move right away. He just stared at the fire, his face blank. Eventually, Dad told us all to get some rest. We climbed into the tent, and I lay there listening. Through the thin fabric, I could still see the firelight flickering. But something felt wrong. I whispered to Evan, who was next to me, "Are you awake?" "Yeah," he whispered back. "Do you think he's really lost?" Evan didn't answer. At some point, I must have drifted off, but I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps. I held my breath, frozen in my sleeping bag. Through the small mesh window of the tent, I saw a shadow move past. It stopped right in front of the tent. The flap shifted slightly, like someone was testing it. I squeezed my eyes shut and stayed completely still. The footsteps moved away after a moment, and I heard them circling the camp, slow and deliberate. The next morning, when I finally opened my eyes, the fire was out. "Brian," and all of his gear was gone. There wasn't even a trace of his tent. We packed up and left that morning. None of us talked about it, but as we drove away, Evan said quietly, "He knew we were here before we found him." Dad didn't say anything. He just tightened his grip on the wheel. 15 years later, I still don't know what he was or what he wanted. But sometimes, when I'm in a quiet place, deep in the woods, where no one else is around, I feel like I'm being watched. And I wonder if Brian is still out there, waiting for someone else to find him. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed our stories, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more. Your support means the world to us. Stay safe and stay spooky.